On the evening of October 25, 1994, in the small town of Union, South Carolina, Susan Smith made a frantic 911 call. She reported that a black man had carjacked her vehicle with her two young sons, Michael and Alex, still strapped inside. This desperate plea launched a nationwide search, captivating the nation and gripping hearts everywhere. The image of a distraught mother, pleading for the safe return of her children, became a fixture on news broadcasts. The initial focus, fueled by Smith's account, centered on finding the perpetrator described by Smiths. However, as the investigation unfolded, inconsistencies began to surface, casting a long shadow of doubt over Smith's story. The case quickly transformed from a search for a carjacker to a painstaking unraveling of a far more complex and disturbing truth. The case resonated deeply with the public, partly due to its seeming randomness and the inherent vulnerability of the victims. Two innocent children. The idea of a carjacking, a crime that strikes fear in many, occurring in a seemingly quiet town like Union, amplified the narrative. The initial public outpouring of sympathy and support for Susan Smith was immense. People across the country held vigils, offered prayers, and assisted in the search efforts. The media played a significant role in disseminating information and shaping public perception. The relentless coverage ensured that the story remained at the forefront of national consciousness, adding to the pressure on law enforcement to find a swift resolution. This initial phase of the investigation, marked by widespread concern and frantic searching, stands in stark contrast to the chilling revelations that were to follow. Union, South Carolina, in 1994, was a town much like many others across the American South. Characterized by a close-knit community and a slower pace of life, it was the kind of place where such a crime seemed unthinkable. This context is crucial to understanding the impact of Smith's allegations. Her claim of a carjacking by a black man injected an element of racial tension into the narrative. Although this was not overtly discussed initially, the description she provided immediately focused the search efforts on a specific demographic, adding another layer of complexity to the already tragic situation. The social and cultural landscape of the time played a subtle but significant role in how the narrative unfolded in those early days. Smith's narrative began to crumble under the weight of inconsistencies in her statements and a lack of corroborating evidence. The investigators noticed discrepancies in her timeline and details of the alleged carjacking. Moreover, no witnesses could confirm seeing the carjacker she described. As days turned into nights, and the search continued to yield no results, the focus of the investigation began to shift. The investigators started scrutinizing Smith's behavior and statements more closely, looking for clues that might reveal a different version of events. The mounting suspicion surrounding Smith created a palpable tension, a sense that the story everyone believed was perhaps a carefully constructed fabrication. One of the key turning points in the case was the use of polygraph tests. While not admissible in court, polygraph results can often be valuable tools in directing an investigation. Smith's polygraph results indicated deception, further intensifying the scrutiny she faced. This, combined with the growing mountain of circumstantial evidence, led investigators to begin questioning her more directly about her account. The shift from treating Smith as a grieving mother to a potential suspect was a delicate but necessary step in the investigation. This transition marked a critical juncture, where the narrative began to move from a search for a perpetrator to an examination of Smith herself. The public mood, initially characterized by sympathy and support, started to shift as cracks appeared in Smith's story. The growing suspicion surrounding her began to erode the public's trust. The media, which had initially amplified her plea, now turned its attention to the inconsistencies in her accounts. This created a tumultuous atmosphere of speculation and uncertainty. The community of Union, once united in their support, found itself grappling with the possibility that the truth was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The narrative of a mother desperately searching for her children began to unravel, revealing a far more complex and disturbing picture. The pressure on Smith intensified as law enforcement employed a variety of investigative techniques, including behavioral analysis and forensic psychology. Experts were brought in to assess her demeanor, analyze her statements, and build a psychological profile. This approach was crucial in understanding her motivations and actions. The meticulous examination of Smith's behavior, both public and private, revealed subtle clues that hinted at a hidden truth. These insights, combined with the mounting evidence, began to paint a disturbing picture of what might have really transpired on that fateful night. 9 agonizing days after her initial 911 call, Susan Smith confessed to the unthinkable. She admitted to driving her car into John D. Long Lake with her 2 sons still strapped inside. The motive, she claimed, was rooted in a complicated relationship, with a man who had expressed a desire for a life without children. This shocking revelation sent shockwaves across the nation, turning the narrative on its head. The image of the grieving mother was shattered, replaced by the chilling realization that she was responsible for the very tragedy she had so publicly mourned. The case of Susan Smith became a stark reminder of the complexities of human behavior and the dark secrets that can lie hidden beneath the surface. Union, South Carolina, in 1994, was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked. A small town nestled amidst rolling hills and dense woodlands, it exuded a sense of tranquility and community. Life revolved around the local textile mill, family gatherings, and church on Sundays. Children played freely in the streets, their laughter echoing through the quiet neighborhoods. The rhythm of life was slow, predictable, almost idyllic. There was a shared sense of trust, a belief in the inherent goodness of their neighbors. The air was often thick with the sweet scent of honeysuckle and pine, and fireflies danced in the twilight, their lights illuminating the warm summer nights. It was a place where tragedy seemed unimaginable, a world away from the harsh realities of crime often seen in larger cities. Susan Smith, a young mother of two, lived a seemingly ordinary life within this close-knit community. She worked as a clerk at the local Conso products plant, a job that provided a modest income for her and her sons, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex. Her days were filled with the routine of motherhood, preparing meals, caring for her children, and managing the household. She was often seen pushing her sons in a stroller through the town square or visiting with friends at the local diner. Outwardly, her life appeared unremarkable, blending seamlessly into the tapestry of the small town. There were no outward signs of struggle or distress, no indications that anything was amiss in her life. She seemed to be a devoted mother, her world revolving around the well-being of her children. Neighbors recall Susan as being quiet and reserved, but always polite and friendly. She was often seen interacting with her sons in the yard, their laughter a familiar sound in the neighborhood. There were backyard barbecues and casual gatherings, moments of shared joy and community bonding. Children played together in the yards, their innocent games filling the air with a sense of carefree happiness. Summers were spent swimming in the local lake, enjoying picnics under the shade of oak trees, and watching fireworks light up the night sky on the 4th of July. It was a community where neighbors looked out for each other, where doors were always open, and where children could roam freely without fear. Susan's home on Monarch Mill Road was a modest single-story house with a small front yard and a swing set in the back. The house was always neatly kept, with a well-maintained garden and toys scattered around the yard, evidence of the presence of young children. Inside, photographs of Michael and Alex adorned the walls, capturing moments of childhood joy and family connection. The home was a reflection of her life as a young mother, a sanctuary for her and her children. There was a sense of normalcy, a quiet domesticity that blended seamlessly into the peaceful landscape of the town. The community was tightly interwoven, with generations of families residing in the area. The local church served as a central hub, a place for spiritual guidance, social gatherings, and community support. Sundays were marked by the sound of church bells, families dressed in their Sunday best, and the shared sense of belonging that came with being part of a close-knit community. There was a shared history, a collective memory that bound the residents together. The town held an annual Founders' Day celebration, a testament to its history and the enduring spirit of its people. Susan regularly attended services at the First Baptist Church of Union, often accompanied by her sons. She participated in church activities and was known to many members of the congregation. She was seen as a devoted mother, dedicated to raising her children within the framework of faith and community. Her involvement in the church reflected the values and traditions of the town, a place where faith played a central role in the lives of its residents. Autumn in Union brought with it the vibrant colors of changing leaves, the crispness of the air, and the excitement of the upcoming holidays. The town square would be adorned with festive decorations, and the aroma of pumpkin spice and apple cider would fill the air. It was a time for family gatherings, community celebrations, and a renewed sense of togetherness. The annual Halloween parade was a highlight of the season, with children dressed in costumes parading through the streets, their laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. In the backdrop of this seemingly idyllic community, a tragedy was about to unfold that would shatter the town's tranquility and expose a darkness that lay hidden beneath the surface. The events of October 25, 1994, would forever change the lives of the residents of Union, South Carolina, and leave an indelible mark on the nation's collective memory. The disappearance of Susan Smith's two young sons would unravel a web of deceit, betrayal, and unimaginable heartbreak, forever altering the perception of this once peaceful town. We left off discussing Susan Smith's claim that a black man carjacked her vehicle with her 2 young sons, Michael and Alex, still strapped inside. It was October 25th, 1994, a Tuesday evening. Union, South Carolina, a small town where incidents like this were incredibly rare, was thrown into a state of panic. The community rallied around Susan, a young, distraught mother, seemingly a victim of a horrific crime. Searches began immediately, spanning across state lines, fueled by both law enforcement and concerned citizens. The image of a black man as the perpetrator was broadcast nationwide, further escalating racial tensions that already simmered beneath the surface of this southern town. The narrative of a vulnerable white woman and her children falling prey to a dangerous outsider solidified in the public consciousness, quickly shaping the initial investigation. And that narrative was powerful. The media latched onto the story, amplifying Susan's account and the image of the carjacker. The nation watched as Susan made tearful pleas on television for the safe return of her children. The FBI joined the investigation, resources poured into the small town, and the search intensified. Every passing hour added to the mounting tension, the collective hope dwindling as days turned into nights. The story dominated headlines, pushing other news aside. The nation was captivated by the unfolding drama, waiting with bated breath for any news, any sign of the missing boys. This pervasive media coverage, however, would later be scrutinized for its role in shaping public perception and potentially influencing the direction of the investigation itself. It was a period of intense uncertainty and fear, particularly for parents across the country who found themselves grappling with a nightmare scenario that seemed all too real. In the midst of this chaos, investigators meticulously pieced together the timeline of events leading up to the alleged carjacking. Susan claimed she had been driving her Mazda Protege with Michael and Alex when she stopped at a red light on a quiet road. According to her account, a black man approached her car, forced her out at gunpoint, and drove off with her son still inside. She reported the incident to the police around 9:24 p.m., setting off the immediate and widespread search. The details of her story were repeated and amplified, becoming the foundation of the early investigation. However, even at this early stage, certain aspects of Susan's account seemed to trouble some investigators, although these concerns were initially overshadowed by the urgency of finding the missing children. It's crucial to remember the context of this time. Union was a small, close-knit community where trust was often implicit, especially within established social circles. Susan Smith was a local, someone familiar to many in the town. Her family was known, respected. This context played a significant role in how her story was initially received, lending it a certain credibility that might not have existed in a larger, more anonymous environment. This inherent trust within the community, while understandable, could have unintentionally created a blind spot, making it more difficult to question the narrative presented by someone considered one of their own. It's a complex dynamic, one that often surfaces in cases involving smaller communities. And what about the seemingly idyllic life Susan projected? Exactly. From the outside, Susan Smith appeared to live a relatively normal life. She worked as a bookkeeper, was married, and was a mother to 2 young boys. Her social circle described her as quiet, even reserved, but outwardly loving towards her children. Pictures released to the media showed a smiling, seemingly happy family. This image of normalcy further reinforced the narrative of a random, senseless act of violence perpetrated against an unsuspecting mother. It played into the public's fear of the unknown, the lurking danger that could shatter the facade of ordinary life in an instant. However, as the investigation progressed, the investigators began to look more closely at this image of normalcy, searching for any cracks that might reveal a different story. The public perception of the case rested heavily on that image. It fueled the sense of outrage and fear that gripped the nation. The idea of a young mother randomly targeted, her children abducted, it tapped into a primal fear that resonated deeply with parents everywhere. The search efforts intensified, driven by this collective anxiety and a desperate hope that Michael and Alex would be found safe. Volunteers joined law enforcement, combing through fields, woods, and any area where the car might have been abandoned. The entire nation was holding its breath, waiting for a breakthrough in the case. Yet, as days passed with no sign of the children, a subtle unease began to creep into the narrative. The lack of concrete evidence supporting Susan's account began to raise questions, whispers of doubt that would soon grow louder. And while the community rallied around Susan, offering support and comfort, investigators were quietly shifting their focus. The initial assumption that this was a random carjacking by a stranger was starting to be reevaluated. The lack of witnesses, the absence of any other reports of similar incidents in the area, these were red flags. They began to delve deeper into Susan's life, looking beyond the surface, beyond the image she presented to the world. They spoke with her family, her friends, her colleagues, meticulously piecing together a more complete picture of her life, her relationships, and any potential stressors that might have been present. The investigation was entering a new, more delicate phase, where the initial assumptions were being challenged, and the focus was shifting towards a more internal examination. And within this outwardly peaceful community, a shadow had begun to fall. Indeed, a shadow that would soon reveal a far more complex and disturbing truth. We left off discussing Susan Smith's troubled past, her failed relationships, and the complex dynamics within her family. Now, we delve into the night of October 25th, 1994. The night that irrevocably changed the course of many lives. Around 9 p.m., Susan Smith called 911, reporting a carjacking at gunpoint. She claimed a black man had forced her from her vehicle, a Mazda Protege, with her two young sons, Michael and Alex, still strapped in the back seat. Her voice, as heard in the recorded call, was frantic, laced with panic and fear, describing a harrowing ordeal. This initial report immediately set off a massive manhunt, captivating the nation and igniting a wave of public sympathy for the seemingly distraught mother. The initial public reaction was completely understandable. A mother, robbed of her children, fearing for their safety. It was a scenario designed to tug at the heartstrings. Law enforcement, spurred by the urgency of the situation and the immense public pressure, launched an exhaustive search. Roadblocks were set up, countless vehicles were stopped and checked, and officers worked tirelessly, following every lead, however slim. The image of the missing car, a burgundy Mazda Protege, was plastered across newspapers and television screens nationwide. The nation was gripped by this unfolding tragedy, holding its collective breath, hoping for the safe return of the two innocent boys. The story, as presented by Susan Smith, painted a vivid picture of a desperate mother caught in a nightmare. She recounted the events of the evening, claiming she was driving her sons to a friend's house when she stopped at a red light. It was then, she alleged, that the carjacker appeared, brandishing a gun and ordering her out of the vehicle. She described the perpetrator as a black man, providing details about his appearance and clothing to the police. This description became a focal point of the investigation, shaping the direction of the search efforts in those crucial early hours. The focus on a black suspect immediately introduced a racial element into the investigation. It steered the investigation down a particular path, focusing resources and attention on a specific demographic within the community. This, as we will see later, had profound consequences for the investigation and fueled existing racial biases within society. The media played a significant role in disseminating Susan's account, amplifying the image of a dangerous black carjacker and further solidifying the narrative in the public consciousness. The narrative tapped into prevailing societal anxieties and fears, contributing to a climate of suspicion and distrust. For 9 agonizing days, the nation remained captivated by the unfolding drama. Susan Smith appeared on television, making emotional pleas for the return of her children. She sobbed openly, her face etched with grief, begging the supposed kidnapper to release her sons unharmed. These public appeals further solidified public sympathy and support for her, while simultaneously increasing the pressure on law enforcement to find the perpetrator. The search continued relentlessly, with every available resource dedicated to finding Michael and Alex. The investigation, however, was beginning to encounter inconsistencies. Certain aspects of Susan's story didn't quite add up. While details remained scarce in the initial phases of any investigation, certain discrepancies started to emerge as investigators pieced together the timeline of events. The details she provided about the carjacking lacked crucial information, and certain aspects of her account seemed to shift slightly in subsequent retellings. These subtle inconsistencies, though seemingly insignificant at the time, would later prove to be crucial pieces of the puzzle. As days turned into nights, hope began to dwindle. The intense media scrutiny, the relentless pressure on law enforcement, and the unwavering public sympathy for Susan Smith created an incredibly complex and emotionally charged environment. The nation was on edge, waiting for answers, praying for a miracle. The investigation continued, but the initial momentum began to wane as leads dried up and the trail grew colder. The investigation was reaching a critical juncture. Despite the massive search effort, No concrete evidence had emerged to corroborate Susan Smith's account. The lack of witnesses, the absence of any credible sightings of the car, and the growing inconsistencies in Susan's story began to cast doubt on her version of events. The investigators, faced with mounting pressure and a lack of progress, were forced to reassess the situation and consider alternative scenarios. The initial narrative, the story of a black carjacker abducting two young boys, was starting to unravel. The news of Susan Smith's missing children spread through Union, South Carolina, like wildfire. It was October 25, 1994, and a young mother claiming a black man had carjacked her vehicle with her two young sons still inside became a national story almost instantly. The image of her tearful pleas on television captivated the nation, and law enforcement launched a massive search. The community rallied, organizing search parties, posting flyers, and holding vigils. There was a palpable sense of dread, a collective holding of breath, as everyone hoped for a safe return of the boys. The narrative of a black carjacker immediately stoked racial tensions in the community, adding another layer of complexity to an already heart-wrenching situation. The initial focus, understandably, was on finding the car and the boys. Roadblocks were set up, and the FBI was brought in to assist the local police. The description Susan Smith provided of the carjacker was circulated widely. Every passing black man driving a similar vehicle became a suspect in the eyes of some, leading to several instances of wrongful detainment and questioning. The media played a significant role in amplifying the fear and suspicion, broadcasting Susan Smith's tearful pleas for the return of her children on a constant loop. This relentless coverage, coupled with the lack of any concrete leads, contributed to a growing sense of unease in the community and beyond. It felt like a nightmare unfolding in real time. The search efforts were extensive and exhaustive. Divers scoured nearby lakes and rivers, while volunteers combed through fields and woods. Every possible lead was investigated, but nothing concrete emerged. As days turned into nights, hope began to dwindle. Susan Smith's story, however, remained consistent. She maintained that a black man had carjacked her car at a stoplight, driving off with her two sons strapped in their car seats. This narrative, despite lacking any corroborating evidence, continued to shape the investigation and fuel the public perception of the case. The image of the missing boys, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex, became seared into the public consciousness. What's striking about this initial period is the sheer scale of the public response. People from neighboring towns and even other states poured into Union to help with the search. Donations flooded in, and prayer vigils were held around the clock. This outpouring of support was a testament to the power of community in times of crisis, but it also underscored the collective anxiety and desperation to find the missing children. The case tapped into a primal fear. The abduction of innocent children and the uncertainty surrounding their fate gripped the nation. The lack of any tangible progress only intensified this collective sense of helplessness. Law enforcement continued to pursue every possible avenue of investigation. They examined Susan Smith's account meticulously, looking for any inconsistencies or discrepancies. They interviewed her family, friends, and acquaintances, trying to piece together a timeline of events leading up to the alleged carjacking. They reviewed surveillance footage from businesses near the location where Smith claimed the incident took place, but nothing of significance was found. The lack of physical evidence began to raise questions, but the focus remained on finding the boys and apprehending the supposed carjacker. As the days passed, the pressure mounted on law enforcement to produce results. The media scrutiny was intense, and the public demanded answers. The image of Susan Smith, the grieving mother, remained prominent in the media, further complicating the investigation. Her emotional pleas for the safe return of her children resonated with many, making it difficult for some to entertain the possibility that her story might not be entirely accurate. The emotional weight of the case, coupled with the racial dynamics at play, made it a particularly sensitive and complex situation for investigators to navigate. The constant media attention transformed Susan Smith into a national figure, a symbol of a mother's worst nightmare. The focus on her grief and desperation arguably overshadowed the investigation itself in those early days. The lack of any progress in locating the boys, however, began to cast a long shadow over her story. Whispers of doubt began to circulate, and law enforcement started to scrutinize her account more closely. The initial wave of sympathy and support began to erode, replaced by a growing sense of unease and suspicion. The narrative of the black carjacker continued to be a focal point, further fueling racial tensions. This added a tragic layer of complexity to the case. While the search for the boys continued, the lack of any corroborating evidence to support Susan Smith's claims began to raise serious questions. The absence of witnesses, the lack of any sightings of the car, and the inconsistencies in Smith's account all contributed to a growing sense of doubt. The investigation was reaching a critical juncture, and the direction it took next would have profound implications for the case and the community. Let's delve deeper into Susan Smith's psychological profile. On the surface, she presented as a grieving mother, desperate for the return of her children. She made public pleas, tearfully begging for their safe return. This image, broadcast nationwide, garnered immense sympathy. However, beneath this facade, a different picture began to emerge. Those close to her described her as being somewhat emotionally detached, even before the incident. Some accounts suggest a history of manipulative behavior, a tendency to fabricate stories for attention. This contrast between her public persona and private demeanor raises significant questions about her mental state at the time of the crime. We need to consider the possibility that this manufactured grief was a calculated strategy to deflect suspicion. It's crucial to examine the contradictions in her outward identity. She was a young mother, employed at a local company, seemingly integrated into the community. There were no outward signs of severe mental instability or violent tendencies. Yet, the act she committed was undeniably brutal, defying the image she projected. This discrepancy is where the psychological complexity lies. Was she suffering from a hidden mental disorder? Was there an undiagnosed personality disorder driving her actions? Or was this a calculated act of desperation, driven by a desire to escape a difficult situation, perhaps a failing marriage or an unwanted responsibility? We must carefully analyze the evidence to uncover the truth behind the mask she presented to the world. Her relationship with her stepfather, Thomas McCauley, is a particularly troubling aspect of this case. McCauley admitted to having a sexual relationship with Susan when she was a teenager, a relationship that reportedly resumed in her adult life. This complicated dynamic adds another layer to her psychological profile. Could this past trauma have contributed to her emotional instability? Did it play a role in shaping her manipulative tendencies? The impact of such abuse can be profound and long-lasting, potentially manifesting in distorted perceptions and behaviors. It's essential to consider how this relationship might have influenced her actions and contributed to the tragic events that unfolded. Absolutely. The influence of past trauma can be a significant factor in understanding the motivations behind such a drastic act. We also need to consider her relationship with her husband, David Smith. Their marriage was reportedly strained, and they were reportedly discussing separation. This adds another potential stressor to an already complex situation. Did the impending separation trigger a desperate act? Was she seeking a way out of a marriage she no longer wanted? These are critical questions that must be addressed to fully comprehend the context surrounding the crime. Furthermore, her demeanor during the investigation provides additional insights. While initially cooperative, her story began to unravel under scrutiny. She maintained the carjacking narrative for 9 days, captivating the nation with her pleas. However, inconsistencies in her account and the mounting physical evidence eventually led to her confession. This ability to maintain a fabricated story for such a duration points to a certain level of detachment and a capacity for manipulation. It further reinforces the notion that the public persona she presented was a carefully constructed facade. Indeed, the prolonged deception is a chilling aspect of this case. It speaks to a profound disconnect between her outward presentation and her inner reality. It also underscores the importance of thorough investigation and objective analysis of evidence. The pressure to solve the case quickly, fueled by the national attention, could have easily led to a rush to judgment. However, the investigators persevered, meticulously piecing together the truth, despite the deceptive narrative presented by Susan Smith. Let's not forget the letters exchanged between Susan and her husband David during their marriage. These letters, later revealed during the investigation, hinted at underlying emotional turmoil and a sense of desperation. They provided a glimpse into her private world, revealing a stark contrast to the public persona she projected. Analyzing these letters offers a crucial opportunity to understand her state of mind leading up to the tragic event. They offer a raw, unfiltered perspective on her internal struggles, potentially shedding light on the motivations behind her actions. Precisely. These personal documents are invaluable pieces of the puzzle. They offer a window into her thoughts and emotions, unburdened by the performance of public griefs. Studying these letters, alongside the other evidence, is crucial to forming a comprehensive understanding of the complex psychological factors that contributed to this devastating crime. By carefully piecing together these fragments of information, we can begin to unravel the complexities of this tragic case and gain a deeper insight into the mind of Susan Smith. In the chaotic initial days of the investigation, the focus understandably centered around the carjacker narrative Susan Smith presented. Law enforcement resources were poured into searching for a black male suspect driving a burgundy Mazda, a description disseminated nationwide. Roadblocks were set up, and countless vehicles matching the description were stopped and investigated. This initial direction, based entirely on Smith's fabricated account, unfortunately diverted valuable time and resources away from the actual truth. The pervasive racial bias of the time undoubtedly played a role in how readily her story was accepted, highlighting a systemic issue that often hinders objective investigation in such cases. A tragically misplaced focus on this phantom carjacker created a false sense of urgency and direction that ultimately delayed uncovering the horrific reality. The investigators were under immense pressure to find the missing boys. Every passing moment diminished the chances of their survival, intensifying the sense of desperation. Smith continued to participate in televised pleas, further cementing the image of a distraught mother desperately seeking her children. Her public performances were remarkably convincing, manipulating public sympathy and reinforcing the narrative she had carefully constructed. This manipulation extended to law enforcement, who, in the initial stages, appear to have accepted her account at face value. The investigation, therefore, followed a predictable course, focusing on locating the alleged carjacker and the missing vehicle. It's a chilling example of how a calculated deception can effectively misdirect even experienced investigators. During the initial days, several potential leads surfaced, adding another layer of complexity to the already tangled investigation. Tips came in from across the country, each one requiring careful scrutiny. One individual reported seeing a vehicle matching the description near a local gas station. Another witness claimed to have seen Smith's car abandoned on a rural road. These sightings, while ultimately proving to be unconnected to the actual events, contributed to the already chaotic nature of the investigation, pulling resources in multiple directions. Each false lead added to the mounting pressure on law enforcement and further solidified the image of a widespread search for the missing children and their abductor. Adding to the complexity of the investigation were a series of taunting phone calls received by the police department. The anonymous caller claimed to have knowledge of the boys' whereabouts, providing cryptic clues that ultimately led nowhere. These calls, now believed to have been unrelated to the case, injected a disturbing element into the investigation, heightening the sense of urgency and adding another layer of misdirection. They created a false hope that the children might still be alive, distracting investigators and adding to the emotional turmoil surrounding the case. This cruel tactic, whether intentional or coincidental, further complicated an already difficult investigation. While the search for the missing boys and the alleged carjacker intensified, investigators began to notice inconsistencies in Smith's account. Small details in her retelling of events didn't quite add up. Her emotional responses, while seemingly appropriate for a grieving mother, lacked a certain authenticity. These subtle red flags, initially overlooked in the chaos, began to accumulate, sowing seeds of doubt within the investigative team. The pressure to maintain the image of a unified front in the search for the missing boys perhaps contributed to a reluctance to openly question Smith's version of events. However, as the investigation wore on, these inconsistencies became increasingly difficult to ignore. The turning point in the investigation came with the discovery of the car. Located submerged in John D. Long Lake, the vehicle contained no evidence of a struggle or forced entry. This starkly contradicted Smith's account of a carjacking. The discovery shifted the focus of the investigation squarely onto Smith, who had, up until this point, been treated as a grieving mother rather than a potential suspect. The location of the car, a place familiar to Smith, introduced a new and disturbing dimension to the case. The carefully constructed narrative of a random carjacking began to unravel, revealing the chilling truth beneath. With the discovery of the car, the investigation entered a new, more focused phase. Investigators revisited Smith's initial statements, meticulously scrutinizing every detail for inconsistencies. Her demeanor during interviews began to shift from distraught to defensive. The mounting evidence, combined with the pressure of intense questioning, began to erode her fabricated story. The realization that her carefully crafted deception was unraveling placed immense psychological pressure on Smith. The focus now was on uncovering the truth, no longer hampered by the false narrative of a carjacking. Under the weight of mounting evidence and relentless questioning, Smith's fabricated story finally crumbled. She confessed to driving her car into the lake with her 2 sons strapped inside. The motive, she claimed, was a complex interplay of personal struggles and a desperate attempt to start a new life. Her confession sent shockwaves through the community and the nation, transforming the image of a grieving mother into that of a perpetrator of an unimaginable crime. The case became a tragic example of how deception can manipulate public perception and the devastating consequences of such acts. The ripple effect of Susan Smith's deception spread far beyond her immediate family. The entire community of Union, South Carolina, was traumatized. They had rallied together, poured their hearts into the search, only to discover they had been manipulated. This betrayal created a deep sense of unease and mistrust. People questioned their own judgment, wondering how they could have been so thoroughly deceived. The intense media scrutiny that followed only exacerbated the collective trauma, turning their town into a symbol of a mother's unthinkable act against her children. This case left a long-lasting scar on Union's social fabric, impacting relationships and eroding community spirit. Absolutely. The emotional toll on the community cannot be overstated. Imagine the volunteers who tirelessly searched those woods and the lake, driven by hope and compassion. They were unknowingly participating in a charade orchestrated by the very person they were trying to help. The psychological impact of this realization is profound. It breeds cynicism and suspicion, making people hesitant to trust others, particularly in situations of vulnerability. This case highlights the devastating consequences of deception, not only for the direct victims, but also for the wider community that becomes entangled in the lies. And let's not forget the secondary victims, the families of both Susan and David Smith. They were grappling with the unimaginable loss of 2 young children while simultaneously dealing with the shocking revelation of Susan's guilt. David's family, in particular, had to process not only the grief of losing their grandsons, but also the betrayal by someone they had welcomed into their family. This layered trauma undoubtedly created complex emotional wounds that likely took years, if not decades, to heal. The Smiths' divorce following the murders further complicated the emotional landscape. While understandably, David needed to distance himself from Susan, this separation also meant severing ties with the family he had built with her. This adds another layer of loss and grief to an already unbearable situation. The public nature of the case also meant that their private pain was constantly being rehashed in the media, hindering the healing process. The long-term effects of this trauma are often overlooked. The community of Union likely experienced heightened anxiety and fear, especially concerning the safety of their children. The constant reminders of the tragedy, from media coverage to the memorial erected for Michael and Alex, served as a constant source of collective pain. The case became deeply ingrained in the town's identity, a tragic chapter that would forever shape its narrative. Beyond Union, the Susan Smith case resonated with parents across the nation. It tapped into primal fears about the safety and vulnerability of children. The notion that a mother could harm her own children, a figure typically associated with love and protection, shook many to their core. This case became a cautionary tale, fueling anxieties about parental mental health and the potential dangers lurking within seemingly ordinary families. The media's portrayal of Susan Smith, both before and after her confession, also played a significant role in shaping public perception and contributing to the long-term trauma. Initially portrayed as a grieving mother, the sudden shift to her being the perpetrator created a sense of disbelief and confusion. This rapid change in narrative further eroded trust in authority figures and media representations, adding to the overall sense of unease and uncertainty. And the constant replaying of Susan Smith's televised pleas for the return of her children, knowing now they were already dead at the bottom of the lake, adds a chilling layer to the deception. This manipulation of public sympathy compounded the trauma, making it difficult for people to reconcile the image of the grieving mother with the reality of her crime. This case underscores the power of media narratives in shaping public opinion and the potential for those narratives to exacerbate the emotional toll of tragic events. The investigation continued to intensify, with the local police department now collaborating with state and federal agencies. Divers tirelessly searched nearby lakes, based on Susan Smith's initial account, while investigators meticulously re-examined the car itself. The nationwide media attention brought forth a deluge of tips and potential leads, most of which proved to be dead ends. However, the pressure mounted on investigators to produce results, especially given the heightened emotional climate surrounding the case. There was a palpable sense of urgency, a community collectively holding its breath, waiting for answers. The narrative Susan Smith had presented was beginning to show cracks, albeit subtle ones initially. Under the intense scrutiny of the investigation, the details, the timeline, certain inconsistencies were starting to emerge. One element that began to draw attention was the composure Susan Smith displayed in her public pleas. While grief manifests differently in individuals, her demeanor struck some as strangely detached, given the horrific nature of the alleged crime. Investigators started revisiting their initial interviews with her, meticulously analyzing her body language, her choice of words, the subtle shifts in her narrative. They began to subtly adjust their questioning tactics, moving away from open-ended inquiries toward more pointed, specific questions designed to test the veracity of her statements. Simultaneously, the forensic analysis of the car yielded no evidence supporting her claim of a carjacking. This lack of corroborating physical evidence became a significant turning point in the investigation, shifting the focus more directly onto Susan Smith herself. A key moment came during a televised interview on November 3, 1994. While pleading for the return of her children, certain inconsistencies in her story became more apparent. The timeline she presented continued to shift slightly, and her emotional responses seemed incongruent with the gravity of the situation. These subtle discrepancies, while not conclusive proof of deception, raised red flags for investigators who were now carefully scrutinizing every word, every gesture. The mounting pressure, the constant questioning, the relentless media scrutiny, it all began to take its toll. The carefully constructed facade Susan Smith had presented to the world started to crumble. Investigators employed a technique known as cognitive interviewing, a method designed to enhance recall and potentially uncover inconsistencies in a witness's account. This method focuses on building rapport and encouraging the interviewee to revisit the events from different perspectives, recalling sensory details and reconstructing the timeline meticulously. When applied to Susan Smith, the discrepancies in her narrative became more pronounced. Her descriptions of the carjacker lacked specific details, and her recall of the events leading up to the alleged abduction seemed fragmented and inconsistent. The growing dissonance between her account and the lack of corroborating evidence pointed investigators in a new direction. The pressure on Susan Smith intensified as investigators began to subtly confront her with the inconsistencies in her story. They presented her with the lack of physical evidence supporting her claim of a carjacking and questioned her about the shifting details in her timeline. This carefully calibrated approach, designed to elicit a confession rather than a confrontation, began to yield results. The cracks in her facade widened under the strain. On November 3, 1994, 9 days after she initially reported her children missing, Susan Smith confessed to fabricating the carjacking story. The weight of the investigation, the mounting evidence against her, and the psychological pressure finally broke her carefully constructed facade. In a chillingly calm and detached manner, she admitted to driving her car into John D. Long Lake with her 2 sons strapped inside. The news of Susan Smith's confession sent shockwaves through the nation. The community that had rallied around her, offering support and prayers, now grappled with a profound sense of betrayal and disbelief. The search for the missing boys transformed into a recovery operation. Divers located the submerged car in John D. Long Lake, with the bodies of 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex still strapped in their car seats. The horrific discovery confirmed Susan Smith's confession, bringing a tragic end to the 9-day search. The arrest of Susan Smith marked a turning point in the case, shifting the focus from a missing persons investigation to a homicide investigation. The motive behind her unthinkable act became the central question, a puzzle investigators would attempt to piece together in the coming months. We've spent 9 episodes meticulously dissecting this case, and yet, a profound unease remains. We've examined the timeline, from Susan Smith's initial frantic 911 call reporting a carjacking to her eventual confession 9 days later. We've scrutinized the evidence, or rather, the lack thereof, considering the fabricated carjacker narrative. We've heard from law enforcement, family members, and expert analysts, each offering a piece of the puzzle. And yet, a crucial piece seems to be missing. How could a mother, a figure typically associated with nurturing and protection, commit such an unspeakable act against her own children? This is the chilling question that continues to haunt this case. The deceptive facade Susan Smith presented to the world is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this story. She convincingly portrayed herself as a distraught victim, manipulating public sympathy and diverting attention from her own culpability. This performance went on for days, captivating a nation and fueling a massive manhunt based entirely on a lie. It speaks to a disturbing capacity for manipulation and deceit, a coldness that is difficult to comprehend. The fact that she maintained this charade while knowing the fate of her sons, strapped into their car seats at the bottom of John D. Long Lake, adds another layer of incomprehensibility to her actions. It's precisely that incomprehensibility that makes this case so deeply disturbing. We search for a clear motive, a rational explanation that could somehow make sense of such a horrific act. Was it a desperate attempt to start a new life, free from the responsibilities of motherhood? Was it a twisted act of revenge against the children's father? Theories abound, but none seem to fully capture the sheer darkness of her actions. Ultimately, we are left grappling with the uncomfortable reality that sometimes evil hides in plain sight, masked by an ordinary exterior. The Susan Smith case serves as a stark reminder of the deceptive nature of appearances. She was a young mother, active in her community, seemingly devoted to her children. There were no outward signs of the turmoil brewing beneath the surface, no indications of the horrific act she was capable of committing. This case shatters the illusion that we can easily identify danger, that evil announces itself with flashing lights and warning signs. Instead, it reinforces the unsettling truth that darkness can lurk within the most unexpected places, even within the confines of a seemingly loving family. And what about the impact on the community? Union, South Carolina, was a small town thrust into the national spotlight under the most tragic circumstances. The search for the fictional carjacker consumed the town, fostering fear and suspicion among neighbors. The eventual revelation of the truth shattered the community's trust and left an enduring scar on its collective psyche. The case became a symbol of betrayal, a stark reminder of the fragility of innocence. The ripple effects of this case extend far beyond Union, South Carolina. It sparked national conversations about media coverage of crime, the portrayal of victims, and the potential for manipulation within the justice system. It also forced us to confront uncomfortable questions about the dark side of human nature, the capacity for evil that resides within us all. Susan Smith's act was a violation of the most fundamental human instinct, the instinct to protect one's offspring. As we conclude this exploration of the Susan Smith case, we are left with a lingering sense of unease. The pieces of the puzzle have been assembled, the truth has been revealed, yet the fundamental question remains: how could this happen? It is a question that continues to resonate, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of ordinary lives. We may never fully understand the complexities of the human psyche that led to this tragedy, but perhaps, by confronting these uncomfortable truths, by examining the darkest corners of human behavior, we can learn to better recognize the subtle signs, the hidden dangers, and ultimately work towards preventing such horrific acts from ever happening again. Or can we? That's the question that stays with me. Thank you for walking with us through the shadows. The story doesn't end here. It lingers, echoing through time, reminding us that the darkest truths often hide in plain sight. Until next time, stay curious and stay vigilant. Goodbye.